The autumn air at Riverside Community College carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh possibilities as students hurried between classes, their backpacks heavy with textbooks and dreams. The newly renovated library stood as the heart of the campus, its floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the space with golden afternoon light. Among the quiet hum of turning pages and whispered conversations, Sarah Mitchell moved with purposeful grace, her sensible flats making no sound on the polished floors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 34, Sarah possessed an understated elegance that drew second glances without demanding attention. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she shelved returned books with methodical precision. Her cardigan and knee-length skirt projected the image of a typical librarian, someone who found comfort in organization and silence. The students saw her as approachable but unremarkable, a helpful presence who could locate any resource they needed and offer encouraging smiles during stressful study sessions. What none of them knew was that Sarah's steady hands had once sutured wounds under enemy fire in Afghanistan. Her calm voice had talked panicked soldiers through medical emergencies while explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet. The reading glasses that made her look scholarly had once helped her scan hostile terrain for threats. Every movement she made was economical and purposeful, trained through years of military discipline where wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah had arrived at Riverside 3 weeks earlier, seeking the peace that had eluded her since leaving the army. After 8 years as a combat medic, including 3 tours overseas, she craved the sanctuary of books and knowledge. The library felt like a refuge where she could channel her need to help others into something gentle and nurturing. She'd earned her master's in library science through online courses during her final deployment, determined to build a civilian life centered around learning rather than survival. The transition hadn't been seamless. Sarah still woke at dawn, out of habit, her body programmed for military routine. She found herself automatically assessing exits and potential threats in every room, her training an indelible part of who she was. But here, surrounded by knowledge and young minds eager to learn, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. Her days followed a comforting rhythm. She arrived before opening to prepare for the day, helped students navigate research databases, recommended books that might change their perspectives, and created displays that made learning inviting. The work felt meaningful in a different way than her military service, but equally important. She was building futures instead of preserving lives in crisis, and that distinction brought her deep satisfaction. The students responded to her warmth and expertise. Emma Rodriguez, a shy first-generation college student, had started lingering after her shifts in the computer lab, asking Sarah about research techniques for her sociology papers. Alex Johnson, a veteran himself struggling to adjust to civilian life, found in Sarah someone who understood his challenges without judgment. She'd quietly directed him to resources about using his GI benefits and helped him navigate the overwhelming world of academic expectations. Sarah's military background remained her secret, not from shame, but from a desire to be seen for who she was becoming rather than who she had been. She'd traded her combat boots for comfortable flats, her fatigues for cardigans, her weapon for a stamp and checkout scanner. The transformation felt intentional and healing, a conscious choice to embrace softness after years of necessary hardness. The library itself reflected her growing influence. She'd reorganized the study areas to create more collaborative spaces, established quiet zones for serious research, and added comfortable seating that encouraged students to stay and explore. Her book displays rotated weekly, featuring themes that connected current events to historical contexts, making the collection feel alive and relevant. Faculty members praised her innovative approach to research instruction and student satisfaction. Surveys consistently highlighted her helpfulness and expertise. But even in this sanctuary, Sarah's instincts remained sharp. She noticed Derek Thompson immediately when he first entered her domain, recognizing the swagger of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. His friends Brandon Cole and Kevin Martinez followed his lead with the predictable dynamics of pack behavior she'd witnessed countless times. Derek commanded through charisma and intimidation, Brandon enforced through aggression, and Kevin participated through reluctant compliance. They weren't students in the traditional sense, though they were enrolled. Derek came from money, his college experience funded by parents who expected him to eventually take over the family business. His academic performance was mediocre, but his social influence was undeniable. Brandon had earned his spot through athletic scholarships, but spent more time flexing his physical presence than studying. Kevin showed flashes of intelligence and conscience, but seemed trapped in friendships that brought out his worst impulses. Sarah watched them operate with the same analytical eye she'd once used to assess battlefield threats. They weren't dangerous in the life or death sense she'd known, but they were destructive in ways that could permanently damage the learning environment she was working to create. Their behavior toward female students particularly concerned her, as she noticed how conversations quieted when they entered a space and how some young women actively avoided areas where the trio congregated. The library's atmosphere shifted subtly when they were present. Students hunched over their books more protectively. Conversations became more guarded, and the comfortable openness Sarah had cultivated gave way to tension. She recognized the signs of an environment where people felt unsafe, and every protective instinct honed through years of service began to stir. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's approach remained professionally neutral, greeting them with the same courtesy she offered every patron. She helped Derek locate materials for a business ethics paper with apparent irony, assisted Brandon with sports management resources, and patiently walked Kevin through database searches for his psychology coursework. Her military training had taught her to maintain operational readiness while appearing completely relaxed, and she applied those skills now. The calm before the storm stretched through early October, with Sarah establishing her routines and building relationships while the trio tested boundaries in small ways. They pushed limits on noise levels, occupied study rooms longer than allowed, and made comments just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to avoid direct confrontation. Sarah documented everything with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to medical records, sensing that documentation might prove valuable. As the leaves outside began their transformation from green to brilliant gold and red, Sarah felt her own metamorphosis taking deeper root. She was no longer the soldier who'd left the service seeking peace. She was becoming something new, a guardian of knowledge and protector of learning, someone who could nurture growth while maintaining the strength to defend what mattered. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every aspect of her evolution. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside Community College's main library, casting geometric patterns across the polished floors where Sarah Mitchell arranged new arrival displays. The building itself was a testament to modern educational architecture, with its soaring ceilings, natural lighting, and open floor plan designed to encourage collaboration and discovery. 3 floors of resources rose above the main circulation. Desk connected by a central staircase that curved elegantly toward the upper levels. Sarah had arrived an hour before opening, as was her custom, to prepare for another day of serving the college's diverse student population. The library served nearly 4,000 students, ranging from recent high school graduates to working adults pursuing degrees later in life. The demographic diversity created a unique energy, with traditional college-age students mixing with parents returning to school, veterans using their benefits, and international students navigating American higher education for the first time. The main floor housed the circulation desk, reference collection, and general study areas, with large tables that could accommodate group projects. Computer workstations lined the eastern wall, their screens dark but ready for the day's research. Sessions. The second floor contained the quiet study zones and special collections, while the third floor offered collaborative spaces and presentation rooms. Sarah had familiarized herself with every corner of the facility, understanding that effective library service required knowing not just where materials were located, but how spaces could be used to support different learning styles and needs. Her daily routine began with checking the overnight book drop, processing returns, and preparing holds for student pickup. She reviewed the day's scheduled research instruction sessions, confirmed that presentation equipment was functioning properly, and made sure the coffee station near the entrance was fully stocked. These small touches reflected her belief that the library should feel welcoming and supportive, a place where students wanted to spend time rather than simply endure. The first students began arriving as Sarah unlocked the front doors at 7:30. Emma Rodriguez appeared almost immediately, her arms full of textbooks and her expression already showing the stress of midterm season. Emma had become one of Sarah's regular patrons, a quiet young woman whose dedication to her studies impressed everyone who worked with her. She came from a family where college attendance was unprecedented, and the weight of expectation combined with financial pressure created constant anxiety about her performance. Emma's major in social work aligned perfectly with her natural empathy and desire to help others, but she struggled with the academic writing requirements that seemed to come naturally to students from more privileged backgrounds. Sarah had noticed her difficulty during their first interaction 3 weeks earlier, when Emma had spent hours staring at a blank document on one of the library computers, clearly overwhelmed by a research assignment that other students completed with ease. Since then, Sarah had made a point of checking on Emma's progress, offering guidance on research strategies and connecting her with campus resources that could provide additional support. Emma's confidence had grown noticeably, and her most recent paper had earned praise from her professor for its thoughtful analysis and strong evidence base. The transformation reminded Sarah why she'd chosen library science as her second career, the satisfaction of watching someone discover their own capabilities proving deeply rewarding. Alex Johnson represented another success story in progress. The 26-year-old veteran had served 2 tours in Iraq before using his GI benefits to pursue a degree in computer science. His transition to civilian life had been complicated by invisible wounds and the challenge of adapting military structure to academic freedom. Unlike Sarah, who had found peace in the library's quiet atmosphere, Alex initially struggled with the lack of clear hierarchy and defined objectives that had characterized his military experience. Sarah recognized in Alex the same restlessness that had driven her to seek sanctuary in books and learning. She'd quietly guided him toward resources about veteran services, study techniques for adult learners, and time management strategies. More importantly, she'd provided a consistent presence, someone who understood the unique challenges of translating military experience into civilian success. Alex's grades had improved steadily, and he'd recently expressed interest in pursuing cybersecurity as a career path, recognizing how his military background provided valuable perspective on protecting digital infrastructure. The morning progressed, with typical library rhythms. Students claimed their preferred study spots, group projects convened in collaborative areas, and the steady hum of productivity filled the air. Sarah moved between tasks seamlessly, helping a student locate primary sources for a history paper, troubleshooting a printer malfunction, and conducting a brief orientation session for new students who seemed overwhelmed by the library's resources. Her military training manifested in ways both subtle and profound. She maintained situational awareness constantly, noting who entered and left, which areas were becoming crowded, and whether any situations required intervention. Her communication style remained calm and professional even when dealing with frustrated students or equipment failures. She'd learned to project authority without aggression, to de-escalate tension through active listening, and to maintain composure under pressure. The skills that had served her in field hospitals and combat zones translated surprisingly well to library management. Research instruction required the same systematic approach she'd used for medical training, breaking complex processes into manageable steps and adapting her teaching style to different learning preferences. Crisis management, whether handling a student's panic attack during finals week or managing a technology failure during a crucial research session, drew on the same calm decision-making abilities that had saved lives in much more dangerous circumstances. His parents worked multiple jobs to support his college attendance, viewing his degree as validation of their difficult decision to leave everything familiar behind. The weight of their expectations created intense pressure to succeed academically, while maintaining social connections that might prove valuable in his future career. The contradiction between his family's values and his friends' behavior created ongoing internal tension that Kevin struggled to resolve. He genuinely respected education and hard work, principles that had been instilled throughout his childhood. However, his association with Derek and Brandon provided social status and networking opportunities that seemed essential for post-graduation success. This pragmatic calculation required constant compromise of his moral convictions, a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Their collective presence in the library created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate vicinity. Other students instinctively modified their behavior when the trio was present, speaking more quietly, avoiding eye contact, and generally adopting defensive postures that reflected their awareness of potential trouble. The comfortable atmosphere that Sarah had worked so carefully to cultivate shifted subtly but perceptibly, as if a predator had entered a peaceful ecosystem. Derek's targeting of female staff members followed patterns that had proven successful throughout his academic career. He began with subtle challenges to Sarah's authority, questioning library policies in ways that appeared reasonable on the surface, but carried undertones of disrespect. His tone when addressing her differed markedly from his interactions with male faculty members, carrying implicit assumptions about her competence and authority that he would never have expressed toward a man in similar position. His first direct challenge came during a busy afternoon when Sarah was conducting a research instruction session for a group of nursing students. Derek approached the reference desk with a deliberately complex request, interrupting her explanation of database search strategies to demand immediate assistance with what turned out to be a fabricated research need. When Sarah politely asked him to wait until she finished with the scheduled session, Derek's response revealed his true intentions. His loud complaint about inadequate service was clearly designed to embarrass Sarah in front of other students and undermine her professional credibility. The nursing students shifted uncomfortably as Derek's voice rose, his theatrical frustration drawing attention from across the library floor. Sarah recognized the manipulation immediately, having witnessed similar tactics during her military service when individuals attempted to use public pressure to circumvent established procedures. Her response demonstrated the controlled professionalism that had served her well in much more dangerous situations. Rather than rising to Derek's bait, she maintained her calm demeanor while firmly explaining that research instruction sessions took priority over individual requests. Her voice remained steady and authoritative as she offered to schedule an appointment for comprehensive research assistance that would provide him with the attention his complex needs required. Derek's frustration at her refusal to be provoked was evident to everyone present. He'd expected either angry defensiveness that would make her appear unprofessional or immediate capitulation that would establish his dominance over library policies. Sarah's composed response denied him either satisfaction, leaving him with no choice but to retreat while maintaining the pretense that his request had been legitimate. Brandon's contribution to their campaign was more straightforward, but equally unproblematic. He began monopolizing computer workstations during peak hours, claiming multiple seats for extended periods while other students waited for access. When Sarah approached him about library policies regarding equitable computer use, Brandon's response combined physical intimidation with barely concealed hostility. His strategy relied on leveraging his imposing physical presence to make Sarah uncomfortable enough to avoid future confrontations. Brandon would stand unnecessarily close during their conversations, use his height advantage to loom over her, and respond to policy explanations with aggressive body language that suggested potential violence. His assumption was that a female librarian would be intimidated by implied physical threats and would choose to avoid conflict rather than enforce established rules. Sarah's military background made her uniquely qualified to recognize and respond to intimidation tactics. Rather than backing down, she documented each incident carefully while maintaining consistent enforcement of library policies. Her calm professionalism in the face of Brandon's aggression began attracting attention from other staff members and students, who noticed the stark contrast between his hostile behavior and her composed responses. Kevin's role in their escalating campaign was more subtle but equally significant. His psychology background gave him insight into manipulation techniques that Derek and Brandon lacked, and he began contributing strategic advice about how to create maximum disruption while avoiding serious consequences. Kevin's suggestions focused on exploiting the ambiguous nature of many social interactions, creating situations where Sarah's responses could be characterized as overreactions, regardless of how she chose to handle them. His internal conflict intensified as their harassment campaign gained momentum. Kevin could see the psychological impact their behavior was having on other library patrons, particularly female students who began avoiding certain areas when the trio was present. His coursework had taught him to recognize patterns of systematic intimidation and their effects on victim behavior, making it impossible to ignore the harm they were causing. The stage was being set for an escalation that would test every aspect of Sarah's character and training, as three very different young men prepared to discover that their assumptions about power and vulnerability were dangerously incorrect. Sarah Mitchell's military service had begun 18 years earlier in the dusty recruiting office of a strip mall in Columbus, Ohio, where a 19-year-old version of herself had signed papers that would reshape her understanding of strength, duty, and survival. The decision had been born from necessity rather than patriotic fervor, her family's financial struggles making military service the most viable path to higher education and economic stability. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood had stripped away every assumption she'd held about her own capabilities. The drill sergeants had been merciless in their transformation of civilians into soldiers, but Sarah had discovered reserves of determination. That surprised even herself. Where other recruits crumbled under the relentless physical and psychological pressure, she had found clarity in the structure and purpose that military life provided. The chaos of her childhood, marked by an absent father and a mother struggling with addiction, had given way to an environment where effort directly correlated with respect and advancement. Her selection for medical training had come after aptitude. Tests revealed both intellectual capacity and temperament suited for high-stress healthcare delivery. The advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston had been rigorous beyond anything she'd previously experienced, combining intensive medical education with tactical training designed to prepare medics for battlefield conditions. Sarah had excelled in both areas, earning recognition for her ability to maintain clinical precision while under simulated combat pressure. The combat medic training had fundamentally altered her relationship with violence and protection. Sarah's presence had already begun shifting the library's culture in subtle but important ways. Students reported feeling more comfortable asking for help, knowing she would respond with patience and expertise rather than judgment. Faculty members appreciated her proactive approach to supporting their research assignments, often collaborating with her to design instruction sessions that aligned with specific course objectives. Even the maintenance staff had noticed the difference, commenting on how much more respectful students had become about keeping common areas clean and organized. The midday rush brought its own challenges as students sought quiet spaces for studying and group work. Sarah navigated the competing demands of maintaining a conducive learning environment while accommodating diverse needs and working styles. She'd instituted subtle changes that improved traffic flow and reduced noise conflicts, positioning herself strategically to address issues before they escalated into disruptions. Her approach to difficult patrons reflected her military training in conflict resolution. Rather than relying on rules and authority, she focused on understanding underlying needs and finding solutions that satisfied everyone involved. When students violated noise policies, she addressed the behavior directly but respectfully, often discovering that the underlying issue was lack of awareness rather than deliberate defiance. Her reputation for fairness and helpfulness had already begun attracting students who might otherwise avoid the library entirely. The afternoon brought Derek Thompson and his companions to the library for the first time that week. Sarah noticed their entrance immediately, her trained eye automatically cataloging their body language and movement patterns. Derek moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors open for him, both literally and metaphorically. His expensive clothing and casual attitude toward rules suggested a background of privilege that had never been seriously challenged. Brandon Cole's presence was more overtly physical, his athletic build and aggressive posture broadcasting his role as the group's enforcer. Sarah had observed him in previous visits, noting how he used his size to intimidate other students and claim space that wasn't necessarily his to take. His academic performance, based on conversations she'd overheard, was marginal at best, sustained primarily through athletic scholarships that prioritized his physical abilities over intellectual development. Kevin Martinez presented a more complex profile. Unlike his companions, he showed genuine interest in learning during individual interactions, asking thoughtful questions about research methods and demonstrating critical thinking skills. However, his behavior changed dramatically when Derek and Brandon were present, as if he felt compelled to suppress his better impulses to maintain his position within the group dynamic. Sarah watched them settle into a prime study area, their conversation loud enough to disturb nearby students, but not quite crossing the line that would require immediate intervention. She recognized the pattern from her previous observations. They would test boundaries gradually, pushing limits until someone responded, then retreat just enough to avoid serious consequences while maintaining their disruptive presence. The testing had begun, and Sarah prepared herself for the escalation she knew was coming. Derek Thompson lounged in his chair with practiced arrogance, his designer sneakers propped carelessly on the mahogany study table that had been donated by a prominent local family. His latest smartphone gleamed in his palm as he scrolled through social media feeds, completely ignoring the economics textbook that lay unopened beside his elbow. At 21, Derek possessed the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. His father owned the largest construction company in Millbrook, specializing in commercial developments that had transformed the downtown area over the past decade. Derek's enrollment at Riverside Community College was more obligation than aspiration, a requirement imposed by parents who insisted he earn some form of degree before assuming his predetermined role in the family business. His academic performance reflected this lackadaisical approach, with grades maintained just above the minimum threshold through a combination of charm, intimidation, and strategic use of his family's influence. Derek's relationship with authority figures followed predictable patterns. He responded to male professors with grudging respect, recognizing the potential consequences of alienating men who might have connections to his father's business network. Female instructors, however, faced a different version of Derek entirely. He seemed to view them as temporary obstacles to be circumvented rather than respected professionals deserving of courtesy. His behavior toward women in positions of authority revealed deep-seated assumptions about power dynamics that had never been seriously challenged. Brandon Cole represented muscle and loyalty in their trio. His imposing 6'3" frame earned through years of high school football and continued weight training. His scholarship to Riverside was his family's ticket to a better life, but Brandon's heart had never truly embraced academic pursuits. The classroom felt foreign and uncomfortable compared to the clarity of athletic competition, where success was measured in yards gained and tackles made rather than abstract concepts and complex theories. Brandon's background differed significantly from Derek's privileged upbringing. He'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood where physical strength commanded respect and intellectual pursuits were often viewed with suspicion. His loyalty to Derek stemmed partly from gratitude for social acceptance and partly from recognition that Derek's connections could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. This dynamic created a complicated relationship where Brandon simultaneously resented and depended on Derek's superior social position. His approach to conflict was refreshingly direct compared to Derek's manipulative strategies. When Brandon encountered problems, his instinct was to apply force until resistance ceased. This tendency had served him well on football fields, but translated poorly to academic environments where nuance and critical thinking were valued over physical dominance. His frequent frustration with intellectual challenges manifested as aggression toward anyone he perceived as contributing to his academic struggles. Kevin Martinez occupied the most conflicted position within their group, torn between his natural intelligence and his desire to maintain friendships that often required suppressing his better instincts. His psychology major reflected genuine curiosity about human behavior and motivation, but his coursework had begun raising uncomfortable questions about his own choices and relationships. Kevin possessed the intellectual capacity to recognize the problematic nature of his companion's behavior, while lacking the emotional courage to distance himself from their influence. Kevin's family had immigrated from El Salvador when he was 12, sacrificing enormously to provide educational opportunities their homeland couldn't offer. She learned to inflict damage when necessary, while dedicating her primary energy to healing and preservation of life. Hand-to-hand combat instruction had been comprehensive, covering everything from basic defensive techniques to advanced disabling maneuvers designed for close-quarters engagement. The training had emphasized efficiency over brutality, teaching soldiers to neutralize threats quickly and definitively rather than engaging in prolonged physical confrontations. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had tested every aspect of her training in ways that no simulation could replicate. The forward operating base outside Kandahar had been a constant target for insurgent attacks, creating an environment where medical personnel faced the dual challenges of treating casualties while defending their positions. Sarah's first month in country had included 3 rocket attacks on the base hospital, forcing her to perform emergency surgery while wearing full body armor and maintaining awareness of potential evacuation procedures. The relationships forged in that environment had been unlike anything in civilian life. Trust became absolute necessity when your survival depended on colleagues performing their duties flawlessly under extreme stress. Sarah had formed bonds with fellow soldiers that transcended normal friendship, creating a brotherhood and sisterhood based on shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. These relationships had sustained her through the darkest moments of deployment, when casualty rates spiked and the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm even the most dedicated personnel. Her second deployment had brought additional responsibilities as she was promoted to senior medical non-commissioned officer, responsible for training and supervising junior medics while continuing to provide direct patient care. The leadership role had required her to balance compassion with authority, ensuring that her team maintained both clinical competence and emotional resilience in an environment designed to erode both. Sarah had discovered that effective leadership in combat zones required absolute honesty about risks and consequences while maintaining optimism about mission success and safe return home. The third deployment had been the most challenging as insurgent tactics evolved to target medical personnel specifically. Sarah's unit had faced improvised explosive devices designed to create maximum casualties among first responders, ambushes timed to coincide with medical evacuations, and direct attacks on treatment facilities. Her role had expanded beyond traditional medical duties to include tactical planning for patient evacuation and defensive preparations for medical facilities. It was during this final deployment that Sarah's hand-to-hand combat skills had been tested in actual combat rather than training scenarios. An infiltration of their forward operating base had resulted in close quarters fighting within the medical compound itself, forcing medical personnel to defend patients who couldn't be moved while continuing to provide care to wounded colleagues. Sarah had engaged 3 insurgents in direct combat, using techniques learned in training to disable threats while protecting vulnerable patients. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but had crystallized her understanding of violence as a tool rather than an expression of anger or aggression. Her military training had taught her to apply force with surgical precision, using only the minimum amount necessary to achieve tactical objectives. The psychological impact of taking lives in defense of others had been profound, but her sense of purpose had remained clear throughout the engagement and its aftermath. Her transition back to civilian life had been complicated by the intensity of her combat experiences. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in Afghanistan didn't simply disappear upon returning to Ohio, creating challenges in normal social interactions where her automatic threat assessment seemed excessive and paranoid. Simple activities like grocery shopping or attending movies became exercises in managing anxiety as her nervous system remained calibrated for survival in hostile environments. The decision to pursue library science had emerged from her desire to channel her protective instincts towards something constructive rather than destructive. Libraries represented everything she'd fought to defend: free access to information, safe spaces for learning and growth, and communities built around shared pursuit of knowledge rather than domination through force. Her graduate coursework had provided intellectual challenges that engaged her mind while offering healing from the psychological wounds of military service. Her relocation to Millbrook had been intentional, seeking a community small enough to feel manageable while large enough to offer meaningful professional opportunities. The position at Riverside Community College had seemed perfect, combining her desire to serve others with her need for a stable, peaceful environment where her military background would be an asset rather than a liability. The college's commitment to supporting veterans and first-generation students aligned perfectly with her own values and experiences. Sarah's approach to library work reflected her military training in ways both obvious and subtle. Her attention to detail ensured that resources were organized efficiently and maintained properly. Her ability to remain calm under pressure served her well during busy periods when multiple demands competed for her attention. Most importantly, her protective instincts had found new expression in creating safe learning environments where students could explore ideas without fear of judgment or intimidation. The skills that had served her in combat zones translated remarkably well to civilian challenges. De-escalation techniques learned for dealing with hostile populations proved valuable when managing conflicts between students or addressing patron complaints. Her experience training junior soldiers had prepared her for instructing students in research methods and information literacy. Even her medical background contributed to her effectiveness as she'd learned to triage situations quickly and allocate resources where they would have maximum positive impact. Her physical capabilities remained formidable despite her transition to civilian life. Sarah maintained the fitness standards she'd adhered to during military service, running daily and practicing combat techniques to preserve muscle memory and reflexes. Her strength wasn't immediately apparent to casual observers, as she'd learned to carry herself in ways that projected competence without intimidation. The weapons training that had been second nature during military service had been replaced by an intimate knowledge of improvised defensive tools and environmental advantages available in civilian settings. Sarah's understanding of predatory behavior had been honed through military intelligence briefings about insurgent tactics and human trafficking operations that targeted vulnerable populations. She could recognize manipulation strategies, intimidation, patterns and escalation indicators that might escape notice by civilians who'd never been trained to identify such threats. This knowledge made her particularly sensitive to situations where individuals used power imbalances to exploit or harm others. The combination of her military experience and library training had created someone uniquely qualified to protect learning environments while fostering intellectual growth. Sarah understood that knowledge was power in the most literal sense, and that access to information could transform lives in ways that violence never could. Her role as librarian represented the culmination of her personal evolution from warrior to guardian, someone who would use whatever force necessary to defend the peaceful pursuit of knowledge that democracy required to survive. Derek Thompson and his companions were about to discover that their assumptions about librarians, women, and authority were catastrophically incorrect, and that some quiet people carried storms within them that could reshape entire landscapes when finally unleashed. The afternoon of October 28th began like any other, with Sarah Mitchell organizing return materials while students settled into their usual study routines. The library hummed with productive energy as midterm examinations approached, creating an atmosphere of focused determination that she had come to appreciate deeply. Emma Rodriguez had claimed her preferred corner table near the psychology section, her notebooks spread in careful organization as she prepared for an upcoming presentation on social inequality. Alex Johnson worked quietly at a computer terminal, his concentration absolute as he debugged code for his programming assignment. Derek Thompson arrived with his usual entourage just after 2 o'clock, their boisterous entrance disrupting the studious calm that had prevailed throughout the morning. They claimed a central table with territorial aggression, spreading their belongings across more space than necessary, while engaging in conversation loud enough to draw annoyed glances from nearby students. Sarah observed their behavior from the circulation desk, noting the familiar pattern of boundary testing that had characterized their previous visits. The escalation began subtly, as it always did with Derek's calculated provocations. He approached the reference desk with a request for assistance locating materials about business ethics, his tone carrying the mock sincerity that had become his signature approach to interactions with female staff members. Sarah responded professionally, providing him with database access information and suggesting relevant search terms that would yield productive results for his alleged research needs. Derek's true intentions became apparent when he rejected every suggestion Sarah offered, claiming that each resource was inadequate for his sophisticated research requirements. His voice grew progressively louder as he expressed frustration with the library's supposedly limited collection, drawing attention from students throughout the main floor. Brandon and Kevin watched from their table, their expressions suggesting anticipation for whatever performance Derek was preparing to deliver. The situation reached its breaking point when Derek leaned across the reference desk, his face mere inches from Sarah's, as he delivered what he clearly believed would be his masterstroke of intimidation. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear, his words carefully chosen to convey maximum disrespect while avoiding language that could be clearly documented as harassment. He suggested that perhaps Sarah's obvious incompetence stemmed from her gender rather than her professional qualifications, adding that women in positions of authority were inherently unsuited for meeting the intellectual demands of serious academic research. Sarah's response was measured and professional, her voice remaining steady as she offered to connect Derek with other librarians who might better serve his specialized needs. Her refusal to react emotionally to his provocation clearly frustrated him, as his strategy relied on triggering defensive responses that would make her appear unprofessional or unstable. Instead, she maintained perfect composure while internally cataloging every detail of his behavior for potential future documentation. Derek's frustration at his failed intimidation attempt led him to escalate dramatically. Returning to his table, he began orchestrating what would become the defining moment of their entire campaign against Sarah's authority. His whispered consultation with Brandon and Kevin resulted in nods of agreement, though Kevin's enthusiasm appeared noticeably forced. Compared to Brandon's eager anticipation of whatever action Derek was proposing, the plan they hatched was as crude as it was revealing of their fundamental character flaws. Derek had noticed Sarah's habit of shelving returned books during quiet periods, a task that required her to bend and reach while organizing materials. On lower shelves, his proposal was simple in its vulgarity: create a distraction that would position Sarah in a vulnerable posture, then attempt to lift her skirt in full view of other library patrons while Brandon recorded the incident on his smartphone. The scheme revealed everything about their assumptions regarding power, respect, and consequences. Derek believed that humiliating a female authority figure would somehow restore his dominance over a situation where his usual manipulation tactics had failed. Brandon saw an opportunity to apply his preferred solution of physical aggression to what he perceived as a problem requiring forceful resolution. Kevin's participation reflected his ongoing inability to distinguish between loyalty to friends and complicity in genuinely harmful behavior. Their execution of the plan demonstrated the same lack of sophistication that characterized most of their academic endeavors. Derek approached Sarah with a fabricated request for assistance, locating materials in the lower stacks, his performance of scholarly urgency unconvincing to anyone with genuine research experience. Sarah recognized the setup immediately, her military training having taught her to identify tactical deceptions long before they reached completion. As Sarah knelt to retrieve the requested materials from a bottom shelf, Derek positioned himself behind her while Brandon prepared his recording device. Their assumption that she was unaware of their positioning proved to be their first critical miscalculation. Sarah's situational awareness remained constant regardless of her apparent focus on other tasks, a habit ingrained through years of operating in environments where inattention could prove fatal. The moment Derek reached toward her clothing marked the end of their campaign and the beginning of their education about the consequences of predatory behavior. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating in its efficiency. Her military training engaged automatically as she pivoted from her kneeling position, her movement fluid and controlled as she transitioned from apparent vulnerability to tactical dominance. Derek found himself flat on his back within seconds, his breath knocked from his lungs by Sarah's precisely executed defensive maneuver. Brandon's attempted intervention met with equally swift resolution as Sarah's training took over completely, her movements economical and purposeful as she neutralized both threats without excessive force. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds, leaving both young men stunned and thoroughly defeated while other library patrons looked on in shock. The silence that followed was profound and electric, broken only by Derek's labored breathing as he struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. Sarah stood calmly above them, her professional demeanor intact, despite having just demonstrated capabilities that none of them had imagined possible. Her voice remained steady as she addressed the gathering crowd of students, her words carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Kevin Martinez sat frozen at their table, his psychology training allowing him to recognize the moment when everything changed irreversibly. The social dynamics that had governed their group for months had been shattered in an instant, revealing the artificial nature of the power structure they had constructed and maintained through intimidation and manipulation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.